My name is Wombat, and 4 years ago I bought this camera. But how was it to use, does it hold up today, and who the hell am I? All that and more after this obligatory B-roll. As always, timestamps are in the description and hopefully appearing in the bar below, so feel free to skip to any section if you're after something in particular. Otherwise, here's what we'll be covering today. Who am I? The basics of the camera, or what's advertised. The technical, which will split into the sensor and the processor. Videography, photography, the camera's interface, my overall thoughts, and of course, a summary. So who am I? A performer who spent 10 years on the other side of camera before one day I decided to make the switch, and believe it or not, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K is the first camera that I ever bought or owned. Knowing nothing other than I wanted to shoot videos, I did some Googling, made a gamble, and this camera was the result. Soon after, I realized I was pretty crap at this. Figuring I should learn properly, I went to film school, and 4 years later, here we are. I've shot more things than I could remember with this camera, from promotional works to TV proof of concepts, short films, documentaries, and soon even a full-length feature film. So long story short, I know this camera better than anything else I've shot with, both the positives and the negatives. Let's get into it. The basics. The Blackmagic Pocket 4K camera is probably the smallest cinema camera you'll find, and it's certainly the cheapest. It might also be worth noting here that the term cinema camera doesn't actually have any technical qualifications or requirements to sell a camera under. It's just a term that means this camera really focuses on video, generally at the expense of photography. The Blackmagic Pocket 4K has a micro four thirds sensor, which we'll get into in a minute, with dual ISOs capable of shooting 4K in a host of different frame rates and formats, and most importantly I'd argue, it supports in-body RAW recording. I think it's worth noting that many cameras will say they support RAW recording, but what they mean is if you use an external monitor that can record RAW, those will be compatible with the output of that camera. What the Blackmagic Pocket 4K means is you can connect or insert your recording device and natively record RAW in body without anything else, which I will note as the first major advantage of the camera. But let's dive a little deeper. The technical. Part 1. The sensor. The Blackmagic Pocket 4K uses a micro four thirds sensor and mounting system. The same format as my last review, the GH6. Be sure to check that one out if you're looking for something a little more recent. The sensor is just under 19mm by 10mm and boasts a dual ISO of 400 and 3200. Though it is worth noting that you'll only get the full use of its advertised 13 stops of dynamic range at 400 ISO, with 3200 ISO sitting at a fairly reasonable 12.5 stops of dynamic range. The sensor is able to shoot a range of different color profiles, most notably in Blackmagic's Vlog and natively in their Generation 5 Color Science LUT with a free software update, which can be very helpful for cheap and quick turnaround jobs or clients who don't want to spend the time or money on color grading but are after something more than just a DSLR. But of course, the sensor is only the start of the story. The real question is, how well is that sensor utilized? Part 2. The processor. We'll start with a few of the basics, just so we're all on the same page. This camera offers no in-body stabilization, no continuous autofocus, which means it won't follow focus once you hit record, and the autofocus it does have is situational at best. I actually forgot that it was there for 3 years, and when I rediscovered it earlier this year, I quickly stopped using it again. To get above 75 frames per second, you'll need to shoot in resolutions lower than 4K, capping out at 2.6K, reducing the size of the already small sensor. It's an absolute leech on any battery you insert, and it's already probably turned a lot of you off. But it's not all bad news. As I mentioned above, this camera can shoot RAW footage natively, and if that's not something you're interested in, let me save you some time. This camera's not for you. However, if you are interested in in-body RAW footage, then I've got good news. Not only is this the cheapest camera of all time that offers the functionality as standard, or at least that I've come across, it's really good at it. Whilst it may be limited to 75 frames per second in 4K mode, I've never once had it freeze, lag, slow down, or overburn on me when doing so. Shooting in 40-degree heat in the middle of Sydney summer or below freezing camping trips out back during the winters, this camera simply performs as advertised everywhere I take it, which is something I can't say for RED cameras I've shot with that cost more than 10 times as much. Something that's even more impressive when you factor in that it's practically silent. Throughout a day shooting, I cannot hear any fans or other cooling devices on the camera, whether it's shooting or not. Additionally, if you're willing to crop that already small sensor, you can get up to 120 frames per second, which again may not sound like a lot by today's standard until you remember that this is not only RAW, it's on a budget camera. The ability to run and gun, particularly if shooting around a timed event like Golden Hour or a documentary, and know that you can go back and, within reason, adjust your exposure, your color temperature and whatnot, is just beyond valuable. The processor also does a great job at keeping the quality from the sensor during these shoots. Despite being many years older and considerably smaller than the sensor on the Lumix GH6, when comparing the vlog footage side by side, it's clear that the Blackmagic simply holds more detail in the images, and whilst it may not be a problem if you're uploading to YouTube or social media sites, if you're thinking of shooting something to put on the big screen or even streaming services that include catering for 65-inch and larger TVs, having that detail in your picture really makes a difference. It also makes life much easier if your work includes any type of VFX pipeline, and of course, if you need it, it gives you some flexibility in cropping your frame, like if, for instance, you forget that your 12mm lens and your shotgun mic aren't quite compatible. And for those times when you don't want to shoot RAW, the camera's got some great options. The camera offers several different types of files you can record at with many different bit rates, a fully customizable frame rate anywhere from 3 to 120 frames per second, which also allows you to differentiate your project frame rate along with your current frame rate. This not only allows you to move between regular frame rates and a high-speed frame rate at the push of a button, it means that your footage syncs up on your timeline without any post-production trickery. Something which you'll probably be thankful for if you use Adobe Premiere, given it doesn't allow you to stabilize and speed up the same clip, for some reason. But all this has been a lot of talking. Why don't we see how well this all translates in the real world? Videography. Considering the size of the sensor, and I want you to bear that in mind, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K does a great job of capturing images. I love the color science the footage retains, I love the quality of the images, and my local PC store loves the amount of data this camera chews through. Yeah, you're gonna need some serious virtual space, particularly if you're a bit of a data hoarder like I am. Whilst capable of many shooting types, the two settings I regularly use are full 4K at 12:1 B-RAW and 1080p ProRes. Using 4K B-RAW, I'm able to record to either my external SSD via a simple C2C cable, or even just my SD card. If you plan on copying that setup, by the way, make sure you get a high-speed SD card. This one can keep up with 4K RAW at 75 frames per second, but most cards out there you'll find will cut your recording short as they can't keep up with the rate the data is coming out of the sensor. Not something ideal mid-take. Much as I might end up cropping some of the shots, it gives me room to work with and I'm very happy with the image quality. If I'm doing something that doesn't require RAW and I don't want to use my daily drive of the GH5 for whatever reason, I'll shoot in 1080p ProRes, which still utilizes the camera's full 4K sensor, but allows me much more flexibility on data and means footage can be handed off straight to a client with a grade already baked in. Something I've found really helpful with videography work, particularly when shooting for web series. As with RAW though, when shooting ProRes, if you want to go above 75 frames per second, you'll need to crop that sensor to get the full 120. That said, the images are still clear, they're easy to grade and easy to edit. Even on my 4-year-old laptop, which can be very important as many clients don't have as much horsepower in their tech as you might think. The footage is otherwise just what I'm generally looking for. During the day, it manages to capture more light than I would have thought possible with a sensor of that size. In fact, I often find that I need to add an ND filter or really crank my shutter just to stop the histogram from peaking. And at night, well, I've seen much worse. Solid as the camera is at 3200 ISO, it's still an MFT sensor, and that simply means it's too limited by the amount of light it can pick up to really be called a great low light shooter. Now don't get me wrong, it's better than any other camera I've tried in this price range or even double its price range. But I just want to be clear, it's not what I'd call a good low light sensor, particularly if you start to compare it to images from an S35 sensor. Photography. Next up would normally be photos. Now while the Blackmagic Pocket 4K is technically capable of taking raw photos, if you're looking for a dual shooter, this isn't for you. I mean, no cinema camera really is, and really that's all you need to know about it. So instead, we'll be introducing a new section, interface. Or in other words, what's the camera like to interact with? I haven't included this one before as it can very much come down to personal preference, though if you want to see this in future reviews, let me know. Of course, some features are definitely better than others, but for the most part, the interface and interaction with the camera is subjective. Take my GH6 review for instance. In the conclusion for that review, I said I wouldn't take the GH6 over its predecessor, the GH5, because they went from mechanical buttons and shutter to an electronic button, and I hated the lack of physical feedback. Now that's not an objective observation, and I was quite clear about that, but in a cinema camera I do think it's a little different. For instance, on the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, I can swap between my preset frame rates with a push of this electronic sensor button. That is to say, there's no mechanical click or feedback. I may not like that feeling, but on a camera that's designed to be rolling, it's really important that I can change or look at settings while the camera is on without affecting the footage, or rather without bumping that frame. With that in mind, the electronic sensor allows me to easily make adjustments mid-take without worrying about getting a bump or a jiggle in the shot. Additionally, the giant touchscreen is excellent in terms of both responsiveness and navigation. Basically, everything I've ever needed to find, I've been able to in just a few seconds, despite the fact I never actually read the manual. Whoops! It's all at my fingertips, requiring almost no force to activate, and it's also very easy to remote connect to a third-party device such as a phone or gimbal to remote control. And on those devices, it's about as responsive as I'd expect it to be. That said, the screen itself can be quite hard to see during daylight, and it's also locked in, so you have to have the camera at an angle where your face can get directly in front of it, and unfortunately that tends to not be the angles you want to shoot at. When this happens, the screen is suddenly rendered pretty useless and just becomes a further drain on the already pitiful battery. Something that Blackmagic did address in their most recent version of the camera, the 6K Pro, which does bring me nicely into my overall thoughts. The Blackmagic Pocket 4K is the cheapest cinema camera you can find. At about $1,600 new and sometimes as low as $800 secondhand, it beats out the competition by a fair margin. In fact, the next two best options price-wise are the camera's successors, the Pocket 6K and 6K Pro. To find another brand, you're spending thousands more, and sometimes that's not even going to get you a full setup. Whereas the 4K is just ready to throw a lens and memory card on and simply shoot. Well, that and probably a power bank. Whilst it's not technically needed, whether I'm running the camera naked, caged, or anything else, I always make sure to have a power bank with me to make sure I can shoot for a full day instead of just 20 minutes at one time. It's got every input I could ask for, besides from power over C, that really would have been nice. With data over C, power, full-size HDMI, mini audio in with phantom power, plus headphones and AUX in port. It's got a million accessories to customize your loadout with if that's your thing, though it's worth noting that a lot of accessories designed for DSLRs and mirrorless cameras won't fit this camera as it is fractionally too big. This camera is just such an oddity that it's not fair to compare it to anything. Anything in its price range is simply not on the same level. They're unable to shoot RAW at all, let alone internally, and nothing that can shoot RAW or is designed as a cinema camera is remotely in this camera's price class, many being more expensive by a factor of at least 10. That said, the price point is felt. The small and therefore cheaper sensor constantly leaves me hunting for light, especially when compared to its successor, which rocked the far bigger S35 sensor, albeit with an increased cost. The lack of autofocus, in-body stabilization, and terrible battery life make you constantly aware of where the savings went, or rather where your budget didn't. Therefore, it's both the best and the worst in its class. A class that it exclusively roams and may never actually find a companion in. If it does everything you need and you're within a budget, there's no questions asked. This is your camera. If it doesn't, it's not for you. There's no gadgets or add-ons to get around that, but I don't think you can fault the camera for it either. In summary, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K isn't the perfect camera. Its small sensor size leaves me desperate for light once the sun goes down, and its inability to take photos and lack of ease of life items like autofocus means I can't use it as my sole camera or an everyday shooter. But as someone who wants to push shooting materials designed for streaming services or the big screen, there's simply no other choice. Not in this league, anyway. Don't get me wrong, I could spend a few thousand more and grab a Komodo or maybe even rent an RE Mini, but for $1,000 Australian dollars, I can own something capable of making films or other high quality videos. No checks for rental availabilities, no special insurance forms because the camera is more expensive than standard travel insurance would cover. No bulky setup slowing down my shoots or causing accessibility problems on location. No building and packing down an entire rig at every location. I mean, you can build a rig if you want, there's plenty of parts, but unlike most cinema cameras, you're not required to build anything to make the camera usable. This not quite pocket-sized camera allows me to pack light and shoot on the demands of fast turnaround and small budget productions while keeping the exceptional quality of raw data recorded natively in the camera. Furthermore, its choice to use MFT lenses, a form factor literally designed for budgets, means finding some lenses for this thing is relatively inexpensive and lightweight. Now don't get me wrong, you can still burn a lot of money if you know where to look, but some of the footage here, such as this shot, is from a cheap lens I picked up new for just $70 online. Put it this way, for the price you might hire most budget cameras for a weekend of filming, you could own this one forever. And as far as actually sticking to the name budget is concerned, nothing else will ever come close. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed making it. If you found it helpful or you just like watching it, please take the time to hit that like button. It takes a second out of your day and it really makes mine. As far as upcoming reviews goes, I hope to be bringing you at least one new review every month on this channel, along with some behind the scenes from various productions. But if you're looking for more content, I also run a YouTube series, Gamesplaining, link in the description, which covers video gaming news, reviews, challenges, and playthroughs, such as this breakdown of the true Halo experience. So be sure to check it out if that's the type of thing you're into, and yes, that's a plug. If you've any experience with the Blackmagic Pocket 4K or any other Blackmagic cameras, I would love to hear about it down in the comments. And if there's any camera you'd like to see me take for a spin, let me know on Twitter or by any of my other social medias linked in the description. And of course, if you're keen for the next one or you just want to help out that little bit more, be sure to hit subscribe and I'll see you there. But for now, it's time to fade to black.